Hello, and welcome to the Pitchfork Cosmonaut podcast, where we discuss the history and theory of British imperialism. I'm your host, Ashley. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Pitchfork Cosmo. Today, I'm talking to James from documentary makers Prolekult, and we're going to discuss Brexit, the last British general election, and great power rivalry. Hope you enjoy. Yeah, the documentaries are amazing. They're just
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, you're welcome.
Yeah, we'll go from there.
What is Prolekult, and what's going on with it? Yeah.
So Prolekult's a Marxist-Leninist YouTube channel and media platform. We do videos, 4 videos a year, 4 short ones, and then 1 long documentary. We did History is Marching in 2018, which is about major competition between global powers. And we did A Dying Culture, just released last week, which is about ideology in the imperialist nations in this period of its largest crisis, basically. And yeah, it's been going pretty cool.
Yeah, it's been going amazing. Really, they should have a much bigger reach, shouldn't they? Just everyone needs to watch them. But you can, for listeners, you can find them on YouTube, Prolekult, and where else? Twitter.
Yeah, and Facebook as well.
And Facebook, yeah. No Instagram.
We do have one, but I'm terrible at Instagram. Like, it's just vaporwave Marx art in. Yeah, it's not good.
Yeah, I'm the same. I joined it just to look at like my wife, posts pictures of the baby, so I look at that and that's it. So, but yeah, I can't be doing with Instagram.
I don't really think it's a political format, to be honest. I think it struggles for that because of the presentation of it. You're always just looking at photos of things, and it's very hard to engage and build anything on it.
Yeah. So yeah, it's Prolekult on Facebook, and then at Prolekult on Twitter, isn't it?
At Prolekult Films on Twitter, yeah.
And we're gonna cover some of the stuff from History is Marching anyway in today. But yeah, we were gonna start with the general election. So where to start with that? There's quite a lot to say about that. We don't want to get too caught up in it. Go on, you give your kind of gut reaction. What kind of?
So I mean, it's kind of hard to say this because obviously I think a lot of the emphasis has been on the end of the Corbyn project, which I think is important to talk about because it's very clear from the result that the social democratic method of struggle simply can't stand up to the electoral social democratic method of struggle simply can't stand up to disinformation, simply can't stand up to the press kind of racket that we have in Britain. And the level of state intervention and partisan state intervention into that press racket. It simply can't actually handle that. So I think with the end of the Corbyn project, obviously there's a lot of people feeling a lot of grief at the end of that, those who are kind of part of the Labour Party. I myself didn't vote. I didn't advocate a boycott in this election because I recognised kind of how sensitive the issues were. But I don't think that I could have supported Corbyn because of his platform regarding Syria, or, for example, he allowed a free vote on Syria, or, for example, the Green New Deal policies that he's got there, which necessitate further imperialist exploitation from the extraction of minerals around the oppressed world, as we've seen in the case of Bolivia already this year.
Absolutely. And however reluctant, the explicit support for NATO, Britain's weapons industry, and the both sides' approach to pretty much anything of worth. He's paying. I mean, the coverage I've seen, particularly from North American pundits and media, is kind of left-wing and anti-imperialist, generally pretty good on other stuff, and they're painting Corbyn as a saint and a martyr. And a pro-Palestinian activist, but I don't think you deserve credit as a pro-Palestinian activist if you take this both sides approach. Bernie Sanders gets pretty hammered, rightfully hammered for it, but Corbyn seems to escape a lot of the criticism that Sanders gets. But yeah, I definitely agree. I think it's the election. I didn't feel good about it. I certainly didn't enjoy seeing that result. On the other hand, the kind of silver lining is definitely a blow for opportunism, which is just right in this country. So
I think it's going to be an interesting one, though, because we have there the simultaneously kind of the end of the social democratic project, which opens up a lot of potential for socialist and communist organisation, but we also have a proto-fascist government now, which is great. Down the fascist rabbit hole with Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson. It's it's going to be around.
That's it. It's an intensification of contradictions, really, isn't it? And but I also saw a lot of plain bad analysis and a very simplistic, kind of. Well, Labour lost a lot of voters that supported Brexit, but it also lost a lot of Remain voters to other parties, but possibly an equal amount. I didn't check the exact numbers, but I think it's a comparable amount. It lost to both sides. So, what did you think about the Labour position on Brexit? Kind of, stood in the middle of the road and getting hit by both sides.
I mean, me and Alex, when we've been covering this for Prolekult, every time we've kind of seen Jeremy, we've had a saying, which is just that the splinters must be getting uncomfortable. And, it's kind of an attempt by someone who, was anti-EU in the past, and for very reasonable reasons, still tied up with British imperialism, but ultimately just, there was a view of the EU as a potentially dangerous, anti-democratic and potentially imperialist project, which it clearly is today. And you've got the kind of that element, plus the fact that the right had completely seized the Leave argument. In that context, where Mr. Corbyn can't actually promise socialism, which would be what is required in order to leave the EU on proletarian terms, otherwise we have to, as a predatory nation, as a British imperialism, have to take sides in further conflicts with the US against the EU. So in the absence of being able to actually have a proletarian state and a proletarian program, he kind of has to sit in the middle because there isn't a progressive position for social democracy to take. There really isn't actually a position for social democracy to take. Because on the one hand, if it remains in the EU, he legally can't nationalise anything. And on the other hand, if they leave the EU, we've got this fascist resurgence that we can see right now because of the bourgeois terms under which we're leaving. So it's not something that, I don't think Corbyn could have navigated necessarily in his framework. If he was a revolutionary, then he could have.
Yeah, he was trying to navigate the splits in his own party, wasn't he? So the Brexit MPs were voting against him. A few of the more extreme Remain MPs split off. Yeah. So he was sort of between the devil and the deep blue sea on that one. But do you think? Well, I think I know what you're going to say. But do you think or to what extent do you think he was set up, and to what extent do you think it was a cynical move by the PLP? Maybe giving him rope to hang himself in terms of giving him much of the manifesto policies, many of the manifesto policies that he wanted.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think that's true?
I mean, I think that they certainly gave him rope to hang himself with on Brexit. I certainly believe that. I think the PLP's played a very careful game over the course of the last few months, where it's kind of allowed some of the divisions to slip back from the public view as much in light of the kind of Brexit crisis and the Johnson seizure of power, diplomatic coup or whatever you want to call it. And I think that in view of that, they've kind of played a more careful game. up until the election, and now they're obviously wringing their hands and saying, denouncing Corbyn's Marxism and all this kind of stuff. So I do think that there's probably an element of that, but I think the key strategies have obviously been around anti-Semitism within the Labour Party and the charges of that, and just kind of like being really inscrutable about what kind of Brexit position they actually want them to adopt, which has led to that kind of forced compromise kind of position that he adopted in the election, which was an incredibly bizarre position, I've got to say. Like, the idea that you would be able to negotiate a deal with a partner who knows you're not going to promote that deal in your own country just doesn't make any sense whatsoever from a diplomatic perspective. So I do think that there's definitely been some element of that there.
I mean, I think if you watched a few of the non-Corbynite MPs on result day, they were crowing. That they almost enjoyed it, or they found it hard to disguise that they were enjoying it.
Yeah.
And I think now Corbynites are discovering that there is no one else. Like people like Angela Rayner are being put forward, who is known as a Corbynite MP, a royalist. She's railed against kind of positive discrimination. She supports BAE systems, etc. So that's who they're left with, and they're not even going to get that, are they? They're not going to get an Angela Rayner even, or
no, they're going to get a Hillary Benn.
Yeah. Or a Keir Starmer, or Emily Thornberry. I mean, Emily Thornberry, I suppose, is known as a bit of a Corbynite, but she's a fierce Zionist, imperialist.
Yeah.
So.
More of a reflection of how much the definition of Corbynite has been diluted.
Yeah. And then one of his stars, Laura Pidcock, didn't even win a seat. So
hasn't really been heard from since the election either. So just a bit of a. I just don't think there is a project left there in terms of any MPs or any kind of people who could fill the void. Like, it kind of marks a very clear end to the road for that kind of infiltrating the Labour Party strategy. I think it's done. I would stand against it for a long period anyway. I would say probably since the 1930s it's been useless when communists were purged out of it. But I think it's clear now, if we continue with this idea that we can infiltrate a Labour Party and change things electorally, we're going to lose, because we don't have 5 years to wait for the environmental crisis to be resolved. We don't have 5 years to wait to allow fascism to gain power, and we don't have 5 years to wait before the next economic crash happens, and it all gets incredibly, incredibly worse.
Well, if you look at the range, I mean, this is more anecdotal, but I looked on Twitter and social media, and the range of responses to the defeat is just a lot of it's just totally nihilist, like, oh, you just leave the country. Yeah. Which is itself is a pretty chauvinist and privileged non-solution. And then the other responses are, well, maybe we'll come back to that a bit later when we talk about Brexit. George Galloway, etc. So, all right, should we just for kind of, maybe not all listeners are going to be experts on it. So, could we do like a quick 101 of Brexit and Britain's relationship with the EU, its passporting role?
So, I mean, obviously, you've got the fact that Britain's relationship to the EU has always been kind of a contradiction to it, even when it was the European Economic Community. Britain deferred its membership for a considerable period because it wished to retain its independence as an imperialist power following the World Wars and considerably through the post-war boom. Then when you kind of have the problems coming into play in the 1970s with the kind of return to crisis conditions in 74, things like that, the issue becomes more pronounced and Britain has to kind of make more definite decisions on this matter. You've got I can't remember the exact date, but the European referendum around that period where Britain voted to join. And so then we joined the EEC and the European Union, I believe, in that period. But the role that Britain has always had in that seat has always been kind of partial. We've always kind of taken a more reserved role within the European integration project than perhaps any other nation. We've had kind of, Cameron's negotiation of special principles was before the referendum, but there were already certain special principles applied to Britain within the European Union before that. And the reason for that is because of Britain's special relationship with the United States. It acted as a kind of bridge between the European Union and US imperialism over the 70s and the 90s, into the 2000s and now into the 2010s. But as we've kind of seen, the basis for that kind of global expansion that happened following the collapse of the Soviet Union kind of erode, everything fall back into more defined blocks of influence, and kind of new investment opportunities dry up. That question's come up again because competition is entering between the US and the EU. That was clearly observable from 2008 with Obama's pivot to Asia, which obviously threatens a lot of the EU's interests because of China's the EU's largest trading partner apart from the United States. So you've got these kind of difficulties flaring up around then. Then 2015 happens, and you see a world high record of kind of trade restrictive measures introduced into the economy. And so, the splits that were there within the Conservative Party, which reflected different views on which way Britain should relate to Europe in a changed world where America's no longer friends with Europe. Should Britain ally with the EU or the US over that quite kind of question? Those kind of got pushed to the fore because of the Eurosceptic wing of the Tory party. And Cameron was forced to allow the public of the British Isles to decide the question of its British bourgeoisie and which tactical alignment it should prioritise. I think that's become more obvious now that we've become closer to Brexit with the kind of association with Trump and the NHS sell-off that Boris has kind of had since the election. It becomes a lot more obvious about the alliances and where they're tending after. If that makes sense. So yeah, that's kind of a basic breakdown of the political processes, I would say. Economically, Britain's obviously got passporting rights, which allow it a lot of easy transfer of goods and wealth into Europe, and allows a lot of American capital easy access, which is something that's going to be lost following Brexit, which could see the end of the role of the City of London as well. So we'll have to see on that. But yeah, I think, is that about a decent break?
That's brilliant. Yeah, that's awesome. So this past year or so since it began, since the referendum, I've seen some left critiques that saying that they're deliberately delaying so that they can. I mean, it's almost a conspiracy theory, I think. But I wonder how much truth you think there is in it. Boris isn't really a Brexiteer. He secretly wants to keep his hand in the EU. Have you seen these kind of critiques as well?
Yeah, I kind of get. Yeah, there's sort of an affinity between them and the Brexit Party, really, isn't there? And it's a bit silly, and I think it misunderstands what particularly Boris and his little cult of personality kind of want to happen here. So they kind of view this as a necessary step in order to return Britain to a more powerful imperialist power. And they want to ally with America more closely. But one thing I think gets forgotten about kind of what the processes we're living through now is that Britain was far ahead of the game in terms of everyone else. Cambridge Analytica stirred up Brexit and Trump. It wasn't just one of them. They were involved in both, and they were a British company. British Integrity Initiative, which is a secret services kind of a unit set up by Theresa May, was meddling in the United States and in Germany. So these things have been going on for a long time. What Boris and his kind of group want is an independent British imperialism based upon free trade and being able to bolster that with America. They also recognise that they're going to need to be some kind of negotiation with China because they don't quite agree with Trump administration's approach to China, I don't believe. Boris is quite aware of how ahead Chinese tech is, for example, and believes that Britain needs to kind of make the most of that and strike deals with China regarding that. Been quite a few leaks from inside meetings where he's been talking about that kind of element of things. In terms of Europe, I think he wants close relationships with sections of Europe to engage in the common project of tearing apart the EU. So you've got to. The only way that the European Union is going to fall, rather than consolidate itself as an imperialist bloc and a kind of more aggressive competitor than we see right now, is if member states can be taken away by spheres of influence and interests. So, for example, there are already divisions between France and Germany over a considerable number of things, and namely the relationship to Russia and the way of resolving the Ukrainian crisis, because Germany has a lot more to gain from European expansion than France. So you've got those kind of elements and those kind of things which Boris and his group are going to be cultivating relationships with the EU, and obviously do want to leave on better terms than a no deal in order to cultivate those kind of relationships. Right. Those processes are by no means easy to do, which is why the dithering and the taking time happens alongside the parliamentary deadlock. So you've got those kind of two strands of the diplomatic need to kind of play around with European politics and manipulate it from the inside before you leave in order to try and draw off a sphere of influence, I'd say particularly France and Poland, in Boris's view. And so those kind of things are going to be his priority there. The idea that he doesn't want to do Brexit, I think, is a bit absurd.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, a lot of it just seems like tilting at windmills for, like you say, it's a kind of project to get back something that seems irrevocably lost.
Yes.
Okay. Right. Should we now? This is quite a tricky question, I think. Why did Brexit win? I'm not sure there's a simple answer there, but there are critiques made by academics like Lisa McKenzie that this is, this really is a kind of it's a democratic uprising that she sees, and it's maybe, I'm not sure to what extent she's quite she sort of evades saying whether how far she agrees with that herself. I think she probably does, but. Yeah, why did Brexit win?
I mean, there's kind of that narrative, I don't know what you think of this, but that narrative that it was a working class vote. I mean, I think that's probably a good kind of starting point. So statistically, I don't think that's true. Like, I don't think that's I think that's observably untrue, actually. I think there was a working class vote in some places, but that doesn't mean it was the working class who won Brexit. I think that's a dire simplism and only serves to a kind of metropolitan elite narrative about what the working class constitute, or a kind of racist, social chauvinist position on what socialism is. Either way, it paints the working class as kind of a racist segment and we should just follow what they want to do. And that's not true. And I don't think that's statistically true. I don't think that's true in any way. So the other kind of narrative you've got is that Cambridge Analytica just did it, and that's that. Cambridge Analytica manipulated the referendum, and that's got more truth to it. It was very sophisticated in terms of what Cambridge Analytica did, in terms of meme warfare and the kind of. So what they did, for people who don't kind of know, is they scraped off Facebook data from people using kind of loads of different links and things like that, and then sent them loads of memes unmarked toward the kind of Brexit referendum date in order to sway viewers who their AI viewed as swayable, basically. And it did manipulate it by a very slim percentage, because obviously the referendum was won on a very slim percentage, which is something else that gets forgotten a lot. Yeah, so I mean, those are kind of two things that I think were there, but I don't think that was why Brexit happened. There are studies and things like that, but the sample sizes are always quite small, right? We've got to recognise that actually getting to grasp with like a lot of this has been very distorted in how it's being presented, and you've got to do a lot of reading around it in order to figure out who voted for it. Then you've also got to think that like there was a huge shift of opinion that happened just before the referendum. There's kind of a narrative that's cropped up recently that this was as you say, a democratic victory or some kind or something like that. But no one in the working class was asking for an end to the European Union membership. No one was raising that as a demand if you were organised in those communities in that period. They were raising the demands of needing food and needing healthcare and needing housing, which are all things that are not being promised by the referendum, will not be resolved by a Brexit, and will not be resolved by anything but the end of capitalist imperialism at this point. So we have this kind of narrative that's come up that it was a democratic demand that came from the population. It wasn't. It absolutely wasn't. There was no demand that came from the population.
Also with that was the overemphasis on the fact that it was a record turnout, but there was still high. Was it 72% or something like that?
I think so. Yes.
Something like that. So there's still 28% a very large section of the population just didn't vote. So,
and again, that's the electorate, not just the population as well.
Absolutely, absolutely.
You
Which
know.
is that there's several million non-British citizens who didn't get to vote in that, and you could also include 16 and 17-year-olds in that disenfranchisement. So,
and prisoners.
and prisoners, yeah, tens of thousands of prisoners that don't get to vote. So, I think that idea that there's this massive mandate. It's the same with the general election. If you work it out, it's like less than a quarter of the adult population of Britain voted for the Tory government.
And I think
sorry.
the other kind of narrative that this kind of ties into is this kind of idea that features a lot more prominently than just Brexit. The idea, I think it's unfortunately part of the politics of the Gilets Jaunes, despite they having much more radical politics elsewhere, is this idea that there is a rational demand around immigration in Europe for the left to take up in this period. And, there isn't. Because, first of all, the idea that it's a central idea that we have to kind of tail the worst attitudes of the working class is just utterly and completely morally bankrupt. The other idea is that the working class have a legitimate problem here because migrants bring down wages. Well, they don't. There's no statistical proof of that whatsoever. There's some very badly written pretends it's statistical proof, but when you actually look at it, because a lot of the lower wages are, for example, workers who can't actually legally work here and are paid on extortionate rates because of that, it has no actual market impact upon wages whatsoever because it's not recorded. So
and there's lots of evidence to counter it as well. Much more plausible evidence. So.
Yeah, and then you've also got all the idea that racism is an ideology of the working class in a context where, since 2003, every single newspaper every week has borne some headline about Arabs being evil, or Chinese people coming to invade us soon, or crafty Russians trying to, undermine our democracies, and all this nonsense. And we're bombarded by this constantly. It is no wonder that society is racist when those who rule it and those who rule its ideological production want to demonize and dehumanize the whole world so they can conquer them.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's it, isn't it? There certainly is a significant section of the British population that are racist.
Yeah.
No doubt about that. But the point is, like you say, it comes from a media and education system, which is incredibly powerful. And the opposite idea is put across. I saw a lot of Facebook posts, just blaming on thick racist working class people.
Yeah.
The general election. Which brings us nicely onto Lexit in scare quotes. So why is the Lexit position wrong?
Okay.
We've covered this indirectly already, but
Lexit position is kind of a combination of there's a few different ones, but we'll go with the kind of predominant idea, which is the idea that Britain leaving the European Union in some way destabilizes the transatlantic bourgeoisie, which it does, that's undeniable. But the idea is that we can kind of force an exit, and therefore it puts us on terms with just our bourgeoisie, and it'll be far easier to have some kind of revolutionary struggle. That idea is, I believe, shared by a few organizations in Britain, and it's incorrect upon the basis that we're not having what is often thrown around and probably not proudly printed on party materials, I'd imagine, but certainly on Twitter, a workers' Brexit, that kind of idea. There's no way for us to have a workers' Brexit because we don't have a workers' state. We can't organise how leaving the European Union is going to look as working class people in this country. That's not something that is being offered by the Brexit referendum. There is no such chance of a workers' Brexit, because that would mean leaving an imperialist bloc, the EU imperialist bloc, upon proletarian terms, which is not what's happening here. The idea that it brings about chaos in the transatlantic alliance, whilst undoubtedly true, kind of puts some kind of onus upon us to make decisions. And in a long view, so Brexit came about as a tactical result of whether or not to side with the EU or the US. So a vote to leave the European Union is actually a vote for a closer alliance with the United States of America. That's what that vote is.
So the sum of forces is still the same. Like they're trying to say the sum of forces will be less, but it's just arranged differently, isn't it?
Yeah, and it stems from kind of a fundamental understanding about what the disintegration of the transatlantic alliance could actually look like. Because there's ultimately only two ways that the NATO, the transatlantic powers, are going to disintegrate, and one of them is already in motion, and that is the first, the one which is we can today see in the world, is antagonism and competition, the introduction of tariffs and squabbles, the idea that they might be sanctioning European projects with Russia, things like that. That is the way in which it will fall apart. And that leads to barbarism unless it is met by a proletarian response, unless it is met by a working class response, which says we don't want to fight over these things. We can't fight over these things. An anti-war movement that actually stops them from squabbling, because already we can see the effects of that on Iran and around the world. We can see quite clearly the impact that struggle is having. And that's one way the transatlantic alliance will end, and that's the way I believe it will end in our period, unfortunately, unless a working class force emerges, in which case we can have a more positive end than a world war. It's kind of this naivety that by sowing the seeds of the bourgeois destruction, they're going to relinquish class power, because you're not empowering the working class by seeing certain sections of the bourgeoisie arguing. It might benefit us in terrain, but it should be their decision. That's their decision, not ours. We should be focusing on they're heading in this direction and we need to stop them.
Yeah. And the proof that this is a reactionary position is borne out in, look at those organisations that are supporting a Lexit.
Yeah.
And they've shifted right inexorably since then. I mean, a couple of years ago, the CPG-BML, although I had things that I disagreed with them about, I thought, on the whole, not too bad. Pretty good on quite a few things. The CPB as well, they've been an opportunist for a very long time, but I didn't particularly like them a couple of years ago either, but they have shifted right. Both of those organisations. I'm not sure about any others, but this latest incarnation of, I'm glad I don't have to say CPGBML as much anymore. But that's about the only thing I like about the latest incarnation, the Workers' Party.
Yes,
which I've seen quite a lot of interest on Twitter from just outright Nazis and Strasserites, with open white supremacist symbols saying, we love this idea. So
again, I think it's kind of coming down to this. If you were trying to mobilize among the kind of right-wing types that support Brexit and go out and rally behind Brexit, it's not that Brexit itself is a right-wing thing. It's that the people who are out there shouting about it are fucking racists. And the people who are out there with their British flags have always been fucking racist, because it's a butcher's. And when you're trying to organize with those kind of people and you believe that they're a revolutionary section of society, you're going to concede some ground to them, and you're going to listen to that, and you're going to try and relate to that quite a lot. So even if it wasn't wrong theoretically, that's a question that would come up. Yeah, it is obviously wrong theoretically too, but even if it wasn't, and there's not really been any attempt to combat that at all. In fact, quite the opposite. You've seen a defense of it. You've seen, well, the workers have every right to feel this way, and it's, without any kind of duty given to the sections of the working class that they're betraying? What about the migrants who are working class that are in prisons? What about the people who are being bombed by Britain? What about all of these different things that you can't concede to that viewpoint at all? Because, and now the idea of the Workers' Party is kind of taking it a step further, and kind of, there was a paper that came out before, which was the British Worker that they were handing out, which literally has the colours of the Union Jack as the layout. It's not even subtle. So I think it's got to a point where, their views upon this matter and the CPGBML's views upon transgender people, particularly, the idea that all transgender people should be, basically forced into medical prisons in the CPGBML's view. I say medical, I mean prisons. But these kind of
medical pretext.
Yeah, medical pretext. These kind of ideas are incredibly dangerous and have kind of come from really the failure of the left to deal with this kind of concept, I think, of the idea of unity between oppressed people and different kind of types of oppression needing to come together in unity rather than standing by a dominant political characteristic and just kind of seeing there's a lot of white people who are working class in Britain, as the white working class are white in Britain is what the CPG-BML seem to have read. And it seems to be quite it is a chauvinist position. It is a very dangerous position, especially now it's rallied someone like Galloway behind it.
And Galloway said, if you go around calling people racist, homophobic, and transphobic, this is not the party for you. So if you call out racism and oppose racism, don't apply. So
and they have the audacity to call it a workers' party. Workers don't have nations. That's the first fucking thing Marx said, mate. It's in the block capitals.
Yeah. Anyway, I could easily get bogged down on on those vile entities for quite a long time. So by the same token, we've got Remainers arguing that we've had peace. We've had peace in Europe for the longest period of time. The EU protects workers' rights. It's democratic enough for us to change it from, to reform it and change it from within. And also, probably one of the worst arguments I've heard about Remain is this idea that that's somehow an anti-racist position. Supporting Fortress EU, as if that's which keeps out the people of Asia, Africa, and Latin America.
Yeah,
that's somehow anti-racist. So there's a few arguments there about the EU.
So I mean, I guess the first one would be this supposed peace in Europe. They haven't been looking very hard, have they? There's Ukraine for one thing. That's still very much a live war.
The EU has its hand there, doesn't it?
Yeah, back the coup. Euromaidan. Obviously Macron's trying to talk about peace in Ukraine now, but it's kind of hard to see how you could have peace when you've given guns and trained Nazis with them. Which is what the EU and the US have done in Ukraine. It's not something that's going to go away. I fail to see how anyone can see the looting of Greece as a peaceful event. I fail to see how anyone can see the looting of Ireland or Spain or Portugal, the Pigs Nations, following 2008. I fail to see how anyone can see that as a peaceful occurrence. I also fail to see, this kind of illusion there from the Iraq War, that the idea that Europe was anti-war because it opposed the US and Britain's intervention into Iraq in 2003, politically and diplomatically, obviously not militarily. But, it opposed them. And the only reason it did was because Iraq was switching to the euro just before the war in 2003. So it was entirely tied up with its own imperialist interests. which is fundamentally what we kind of have to come down to with this argument about Europe. The idea that Europe is somehow progressive, or that the European Union resolves the contradictions that Europe had been subject to before the World Wars and kind of has held it together. That's a complete and utter delusion. First of all, the European Union hasn't actually existed since that long in its present form. The European Economic Community came first and was by no means as extensive. Europe, in terms of what is called quote-unquote democratic Europe, was a lot smaller then. And the reason that so-called peace was maintained during the Cold War was because there was a bipolar conflict in which the circumstance was balanced, and no one could advance without it overtly in Europe without it turning into a nuclear confrontation. That's why the so-called peace existed in Europe within that time. But of course, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you saw the steamrolling of workers' rights in Europe. You saw massive expansion from Germany and France. You saw massive expansion of the European Common Project into what we have now, the EU imperialist bloc, which has, centralized banking. It has huge interests across the globe. It's a global power. I don't see how, in any way, supporting a global power with, for example, France, the idea that it's anti-racist to support the EU, for example. France takes 80% of 14 African countries' budgets and keeps it for itself. How anti-racist is France? You've got the Yellow Vests right now with the Gilets Noirs, who are receiving the worst repression possible within that movement, being torn away by Macron's bloody state troopers. This stuff isn't discussed by these kind of positions because it's uncomfortable. The European army idea, which a lot of the Remain section of the left treat as a conspiracy theory, well, it already has a branch. It already has a branch of a European army. And that branch is not a military force for striking other countries. That branch is a military force for cracking down on migration. The first branch of the EU's imperialist army, the joint EU army, is for killing migrants. And that's just put it like that. That's what the EU is in terms of migration. The EU is not anti-racist. It's not progressive. No. It is an alliance of looters.
Yeah, I mean, the same people who get upset and rightfully upset and angry about Trump's war on the Mexican border and his concentration camps. The EU's got concentration camps in the Balkans. So. And okay, we've referred to the fact that the EU is an imperialist structure without sort of getting into the nitty gritty of Lenin's formulation. Just a kind of layperson's description of how the EU is imperialist.
So the EU starts, the European Economic Community begins primarily as an economic and political arrangement between France and Germany, encouraged by the US following the Second World War. It was necessary in order to ensure European unity is part of the transatlantic alliance, to ensure its membership of NATO, and it was heavily cultivated by the US. But at the same time, it served as an alliance of these two imperialist powers, which had been devastated by the wars, and allowed them the time to regain currency and strength. By 1974, we have return to crisis conditions. Then following the collapse of the Soviet Union, we see massive expansion in that period. The EU forms out of this, and the reason that we say it's an imperialist bloc is because it primarily forms as a way to safeguard the interests of German and French capital in this period of expansion, to an extent British capital, and operates as an alliance of these capitalist powers in order so that they can compete with American companies, which otherwise would have simply outdone them given the sheer weight of the US's economic and political weight in that period. So it was necessitated for them by the US's competitive power, despite originally being persuaded by the US. Now, as that has grown, we've seen closer and closer integration. We've seen more nations added, but there's clearly a different relationship between France and Germany than there is between Germany and Greece, for example. Greece is not an imperialist nation. Greece is a capitalist nation, yes, but it is being exploited through the European Union. And that is how Germany in particular makes a huge amount of its wealth, which is why it favors European expansion, for example, so heavily. France is now in a greater competitive position than Germany. It's just quite recently happened. So those splits are coming to the fore again. But generally, it has been an alliance of those kind of powers to ensure their competitive viability against the US, in other words.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the Northwest core kind of feeds on the periphery in Eastern Europe, the Balkans, Greece, and also it feeds on African resources and labour as well, isn't it? So
yeah, and some countries in Latin America as well. Europe has investments.
Sure. Okay. Really quickly, because it's amazing that a lot of people don't know this very simple, basic fact about the EU that is it cannot be described as democratic in any way whatsoever. So could you just describe the relationship between the council and the parliament?
Yeah. So in terms of I won't go too much into legislatives. Yeah. I'll just give an example to show how the EU is anti-democratic and can be used as an anti-democratic structure. So, for example, you have an Article 51, I believe it is, in the Treaty of Lisbon, which allows the European Parliament to deprive members of voting rights at any given period for any issue it wants if it disagrees with them. And that's the Commission can vote on this and just deprive you of your voting rights instantaneously. So there you go. How's that democratic? It's quite absurd, really. Of course, then you have other kind of broader issues with kind of the relative power of, for example, France. France is allowed as many budgetary balances as it wants. It can have as much money as it wants. Whereas Greece goes a hair over, it has to get rid of half of its services. You know what I mean? Like, so there's kind of double standards applied there in terms of financing and who controls those financing, given the way that the European Central Bank is structured too.
And I think a lot of people don't even realise that the Parliament literally just rubber stamps proposals that come from the Commission.
The Commission's office is like the head of the EU Council, the head of Parliament. Yeah,
and they're basically appointed, aren't they? And then rubber stamped by the Parliament.
Yeah.
So the people you vote for, or some people vote for, turn out's not that great, but the people that you can vote for just get to go to Brussels and sort of chat, but don't actually do anything and don't really represent you in any way because they don't have any power to. So everything's done by a group that's appointed by the leaders, and as you say, though, some leaders have more power than others.
There are some checks. I mean, I think it's worth giving. It's not quite as cut and dry as, for example, the Senate or anything like that in the US.
Sure.
So, for example, there are veto rules. For example, any vote, if someone disagrees, it counts as a veto, which is to a certain degree more democratic. But that's going to go. Right. Let's just put it that way, because Macron has kind of basically, with his NATO is brain dead and all this kind of stuff, preparing Europe for competition, has said that there's huge problems in the Treaty of Lisbon. There's going to be a meeting, I believe it was scheduled for this month, but I haven't seen any details of it in the press. But there is going to be a meeting where they discuss some rewrites to this and get rid of that veto clause, because it makes decisions hard to make. And that's one of the problems. So the EU isn't democratic, but it's slow because of the need to appear democratic.
Yeah.
And I think that is one of the main reasons it's been on such a back foot with the US and its inability to actually strike back when Trump says we've got these tariffs, for example. It's very hard when, for example, Poland wants to veto anything that you do against the US. So, I think it's worth bearing in mind there are differences in that structure still.
Okay, that's good. That brings us nicely on to talking about some maybe contradictions within these blocks. We've talked about I'd like to talk a bit more about the contradictions within Britain a bit later, but there's contradictions within US imperialism and there's contradictions within EU imperialism. And can you talk about there's a kind of a Brzezinski versus Kissinger, the world island kind of thing. Could you say something about, we don't have two monoliths that are kind of facing off against each other. There's
many. Yeah. So there's kind of an impression that's been given, I think, by the US's kind of domination since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The kind of idea that, you know, the US controls the world, it is imperialism, is kind of the mistake that's made. And then people view China and Russia as kind of, in that framework, people tend to then view China and Russia as kind of the only competition that the US faces in our present period. And in a sense, therefore, kind of configure, irrespective of the discussion of China's political character, but in a sense then configure that particular bloc, both of those powers, as a progressive force because it's against US imperialism. And so you've got this kind of circumstance where you've got the kind of viewpoint that it's America versus China, for example, is the most common kind of perception of our period right now. And that's very clearly untrue when you start to look at how America's behaving. So, like, you've got a circumstance where last year, in 2018, the first person that Trump threatened before the Chinese trade war was Europe. And he did that because he needed to expand America's trade balance, and particularly its oil trade and its LNG trade, into Europe in order to be able to handle the economic stress of confronting China. But in doing so, he revealed that the EU isn't quite as happy to roll over anymore and just accept what the US wants, because they were not happy with that. And they did accept that deal. But then since then, there's been tariffs, there's been complaints, and it hasn't actually stopped. They haven't had a single productive trade meeting since that occurrence at all. And tensions have ratcheted up between these powers as a consequence of the fact that the US, which has for a long period maintained its stranglehold and its relationship with Europe because its capital has been beneficial to Europe, is now turning its eyes east and is no longer willing to give as much attention to its European partners because it doesn't have, it wants more from them because it needs the finance in order to face down China, is basically what that's happening there. And Europe's not willing to accept that because the Chinese trade war also damages it, China being its second largest trading partner, and the largest trading partner of many of the people within the EU bloc, which is the important thing to remember, is that these countries all get individual votes, and some of them, China's much more important than the US. You know, China's much more important than the US, and particularly with regard to European technology transfer, European technology rights and interests and things like that, it's rapidly being woken up to the idea that the US is not going to allow it to develop that very strongly, and China offers an opportunity there as well. So you've got those kind of, that medley of interests there. Then you've got Germany, which has its interests with Russia, and there's Stratfor, the US's kind of shadow CIA, higher up than the CIA, it's a strategic kind of outlook. One of their ex-directors said that the only thing that could ever beat American imperialism is an alliance of Russian manpower and resources and German capital. Right, so there's clear there, and with Nord Stream 2 we've got a process which is a pipeline between Germany and Russia, and the second one, we've got a process by which that alignment could happen. Then there's the internal struggles within the EU as well, which I think is worth talking about. You know, you've got France and Germany tussling. You've got the idea of kind of certain other kind of groups, for example, Poland, Hungary, Italy for a period were trying to form some kind of alliance to kind of reshape the EU too. So you've got all those kind of conflicts going on with the overbearing weight of the pressure from the US there as well. So Europe's in a pinch, and its competition with the US is just something it needs to wage now because it can't accept any more losses. Otherwise, it can't actually stand up, and that's very clear. Because it's not the case that it's just a few trade barriers here and there either. It's like fundamental critical energy infrastructure proposals that the US is saying, if you build this pipeline, we're going to sanction you. Like, and what's Germany going to do? Like, you know what I mean? Like, what's it going to do if it can't buy that? It's going to have to buy American at a higher price, like, which is not acceptable. So you've got all those kind of competitions, and the US itself is now falling apart. It can't maintain this kind of world global rule that it's had for so long. It's overstretched militarily. It's the dollar's being undermined for several reasons. The first of which is that we've got quite an obvious challenge in the fact that there's this switch to a Green New Deal and renewable energy infrastructure, which would completely undermine any role that oil has in the world economy. And then you also have the fact that Russia is selling quite a lot of gas these days, and China and Russia are both de-dollarizing. Europe's starting to de-dollarize as well, so that currency is no longer going to maintain its kind of grip on the world. So you've got that circumstance, and that means that we're in a circumstance where these alliances can't hold out, because alliances can only hold out in any form of capitalist arrangement when business is going well. You can have, for example, any company, any big trading company, the second things go bad, those CEOs turn on each other. They get the knives out. And that's exactly what's happening on a world scale with the imperialist kind of world at the moment.
Mm. So this is all put forward in History is Marching.
Yeah.
And you had a bit of pushback from that on Twitter, and I don't know if you had it elsewhere on YouTube maybe. So people were saying things like US dominance is totally impregnable, especially its military. Something you're just talking about a bit is that the nature of the EU itself is not just different to the US, they were saying that it's totally incomparable. And I don't know what you think about this, but they were saying that what your argument there was an implication that the EU could be peeled off from the US imperialist Pax Americana.
Yes.
Definitely the wrong word for it, but you know what I mean. The implication of that is that supporting the EU would be the progressive thing to do. So were those the main? Have I got the main objections? Were there any others? I can't remember.
I believe those were the main objections. Yeah. So with regard to the idea that US hegemony is impregnable, firstly, that's not even true in a military sense. The US presently has, right now, the US has no aircraft carriers at sea because they're all being repaired.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's not. It gives the appearance of being undefeatable because that's what you do when you have nuclear arms. It's not a case that the US is undefeatable at all. If it went to war with Russia and China, it would fucking lose. It would. There's no way it could win that war. Similarly, if the US is engaged in any more proxy wars, yeah, you've got the problem of just the sheer financial strain that takes to maintain in a context where you're a falling power, that your trading is going down, that your stock markets could just plummet, right? We have a high dollar at the moment, which is something that Trump loves to complain about, because it's very important, because when the dollar falls, because of the way that interest rates are now, normally it takes nearly zero. Because a fall normally takes a 5% cut in interest to stop happening, there's no bottom in the dollar anymore. It will just keep falling. There's no way to ensure it. It will go into possibly hyperinflation. The idea that the petrodollar, for example, backs currencies is not true. So there's a relationship between the dollar and the OPEC countries, which is how its power as a currency has been ensured since the kind of gold standard ended, which was that they would only trade it in dollars. But that's a political arrangement and it can change. It's not tied to the dollar. It's just that those countries will only sell it in dollars and they own the most of it for now. But also Venezuela's changed that already. Venezuela no longer trades oil in dollars, so these things are shifting quite a lot, and it's not sustainable. I can't see any way, apart from maybe perhaps just a surface appearance analysis of what US imperialism actually is, apart from simply looking at its power and going, that's undefeatable, which is not Marxism. That's just despair.
I was going to say, it's almost as if things are dialectical and have contradictions and change, and anyway,
history moves forward or something. But it's also a really fundamentally defeatist position. If you think that the US power can't be destroyed, then hang up your hat and just go and try and have a happy life, literally, because you're not going to be any use if you think that. Because it's just, if you don't think you can beat your enemy, you won't see your enemy's flaws. Yeah, and if you can't see your enemy's flaws, you can't see where they're exposed. That's the practical reason we need to understand this. With regard to the idea that the EU is completely incomparable to the US as an imperialist power, well, yes, in its specifics, because all economies across the whole world are completely incomparable. Like China, the way the Chinese economy functions is completely incomparable to the United States' the way the United States economy functions. But would anyone say that China is not a competitor to the US upon that basis, or is not a threat to the US's hegemony upon that basis? No, they wouldn't, because it's an absurd way to make a characterization of an economy. There are problems within the European project which place it at a severe disadvantage, which is its looseness, its inability to make tight decisions, its lack of kind of coordination and centralization, essentially. But those are rapidly changing, and there are interests there to kind of try and make that more palpable. So we have European R&D projects coming into being this year for military research. We have huge funds being unlocked. We have new cyber taxes being introduced by France, and all these kind of measures to try and make the ship something that can be saleable. And the reason that they want to do this has been very explicitly stated throughout. It's to stand up to, in their words, in the European Parliament's words, in the words of Guy Verhofstadt, in Macron's words, in Merkel's words, in Juncker's words, in Malmström's words, in the new commissioner's name. I can't remember her name off the top of my head. I apologise. But they've all said, von der Leyen, the new commissioner. But they've all said that they wish to stand up to Russia, China, and the US. That's what the goal is. Not just Russia and China, but also the US. So I think that's quite a clear process. And I think as NATO's made it quite unavoidable this year with Macron's remarks on the alliance actually not being functional anymore, the fact that Trump literally stormed away from the summit and left, it's in disarray. No one can deny that. What direction that will take, whether Europe will or will not split, is still not determined. It's not determinable how these things will necessarily end up. But there's more agreement between China and the US now with this provisional trade war agreement than there has been between the EU and the US at this point. Right? So we need to kind of, I don't think, not that I'm saying that trade war is going to cease, but as a provisional step, that's there. So I think that, that the idea that Europe might curve off is something that needs to be talked about as well, because it kind of ties into something that's always been at the back of the American consciousness about potential European strategic competitor, the back of the European kind of consciousness about its relationship to Russia, and the kind of, it's quite a plausible idea. But the EU wishes to expand into Asia, something that it wishes to do. And Eurasia is not impossible with an alliance between Russia and the EU. And an alliance between Russia and the EU is actually not impossible if the US backs away from the situation and Britain backs away from the situation, or Britain and the US are excluded from the situation, depending on which development that takes. We've already got Macron saying we need to think of Russia as a friend, not an enemy. Quite clearly making this push. You've got Nord Stream 2, which is being defended virulently by Germany from US sanctions. So the idea that Europe might actually change its geopolitical alliance isn't that absurd in view of that relationship. The idea that development would be viewed as progressive, I think, is a problem, because we could debate and quibble all day about the forces at play here, but no one can deny that France, which extorts, as I've said, 14 African countries' budgets, Germany, which extorts from all of these countries in the European Union, they are imperialists. And we know what happens when imperialists make war with each other or confront each other. It leads to mass graves and torture camps and massive, massive problems for the whole world. So irrespective of what you understand of kind of any of these other kind of countries, these kind of issues aren't going to go away, and the character of that confrontation is nothing positive for humanity and can't resolve in anything positive for humanity. So I don't see how a simple change in the structure of imperialism does not mean the end of imperialism. Unless you reduce imperialism to America, it's not imperialism that's ending right now. It's American dominance of imperialist society.
Absolutely. And if you look at the build-up to both previous world wars, the same thing happened. That alliances were made and fell, and you had the Strasser Front, and the various Anglo-German pacts, and all this kind of thing. And retrospectively, you wouldn't say, oh well, that was progressive or anything like that. So you wouldn't say Britain was suddenly progressive. Even if it was fighting against another imperialist. So, okay. So within Britain, we've got the split into two camps: the Remain camp that wants to stick with the EU, and we've got the Brexiteers that want to. What's their slogan? Take Britain back, something like that. And basically, burrow deeper into America's pocket. Can we paint a more detailed picture about like who actually are these people? Because the media, certainly all the tabloids were very pro-Brexit. I suppose you've got Remain papers like The Independent and The Guardian.
Yeah.
But yeah, like are there specific industries that are backing this or the other? City of London, are they split within themselves, or are they? Can they be described as solidly for one or the other?
I mean, it's quite a contradiction in terms of these kind of. This is why 2016 is such an ideologically important moment. Okay, so the surety of the financial bourgeoisie was kind of disrupted by the innovations brought about by the tech bourgeoisie, which is quite a confusing thing to have happened. But so, for example, the City of London with Brexit broadly is in favour of Remain because it's a huge lucrative market for finance capital, and it provides Britain with a lot of rights with regard to the export of finance capital. So they were broadly in favour, apart from a section of them who are gambling upon the shorting the pound.
To underline that with an anecdote, I knew a guy who he still works in the City of London, and he wanted to vote Brexit because of racism, but he voted Remain because of his job. So he's kind of torn.
Wow. Well, I mean, that's just like the clearest communication of it being bourgeois interests on both sides I think I've ever heard. But yeah, so you've got like on the Leave side, in terms of industries, it's largely disaster capitalists who are shorting the pound, like who understand that who really kind of understand that Britain isn't a very productive country anymore, that the basis of Britain's economy is fucked, and that in order to retain Britain as a profitable enterprise, wage conditions, labour conditions are going to have to be absolutely decimated. It all needs to be kind of thrown up in the air for a period, so kind of new low interest rates for investment and things like that can be brought in to bring capital back into Britain that it would have otherwise lost.
But they'd still be financiers, though.
Yeah, there would still be financiers. There are different factions of financiers, and they're not largely located within the City of London. This is people like Aaron Banks and things like that, who are more independent than that, who sit outside of this. And they're very involved. I mean, Mogg obviously as well, he's one of these people who has connections with these type of people and makes a lot of money from this. They all do. So you've got those kind of sections. The relationship of the secret services and the tech industry to it is very interesting, however. So this is where things get a little bit more complicated, because whilst the financial bourgeoisie broadly supported Remain, and maybe petty bourgeois kind of small businesses broadly more supported Leave in general, we also have the decisive element, which is you have what little kind of tech industry exists within Britain. You have Cambridge Analytica, which is not an insignificant thing because it's not just that company. It's held by a holding group called SCL Group, who are still around and are still working on campaigns all across the world for Britain, and still doing, in fact, working on the Trump campaign next year. So you've got this kind of group, and they sided with the Leave cause, obviously. That is significant because they are a new force within this political kind of arena that we haven't really seen before, which I think is what has fundamentally disturbed the ideological integrity of the bourgeoisie here, is they're dealing with a new force, a new kind of new money almost, which is uppity and wants to disrupt things and change how they work. And I think that's really the qualitatively new kind of force that emerged to support this. Because, you know, in a wild stab, you could have always said that small businesses would probably support a more parochial nationalist vision, and imperialist forces would probably support a more unified bloc type provision. But that's kind of the shake-up of it, is the ideological kind of industries and the tech bourgeoisie kind of shaking that up, alongside some kind of very dodgy money.
Right.
So, yeah, sorry, go on.
No, was I interrupting you then? Were you going to continue?
No.
Go through. Okay. Yeah, well, I was just going to say, like, what? So when you say the more of the imperialist bourgeoisie outside of finance, mining companies,
yeah,
weapons companies, food, you know, the big food transnationals, Unilever and all those lot, Diageo, tobacco, British American tobacco, imperial brands. Would you say that they're broadly Remain or Brexit?
It varies based upon setup, basically. I would say, yeah, that would be my kind of opinion. There are some British companies who are quite pro-leave, like, for example, Wetherspoons. Wetherspoons is a very pro-leave British company. Okay. Which is an interesting one because it's going to completely fuck his business. But you know, at this point, it might as well be asset stripping Britain as well. That's the other thing. So, yeah, manufacturing companies are very pro-Remain as well. That's a big one. Steelworks, for example, very pro-Remain. Car manufacturing, very pro-Remain because of the amount of Japanese investment that is needed by things like that. And German investment. And then
big pharma, GSK, AstraZeneca.
They're quite big. Pharma is obviously pro-leave. Like most US companies are pro-leave. McDonald's is very pro-leave. Burger King, all these kind of big fast food restaurants. They're kind of American healthcare is salivating. And they are going to get what they want. So those kind of companies are definitely pro-leave. It's the thing with it is, in terms of kind of business and capital, you're going to get a divide along interests. So like British farming receives a huge amount of subsidies from the EU. So broadly is pro-Remain. Yeah. But then same with steelworks and things like that. Those industries which are not particularly reliant on Europe are reliant on America. So they're going to be like quite happy at the idea of a prospect. But it doesn't even break down by industry as often as not. You have to look into a lot of these people's personalities kind of quite directly.
Right. Yeah, that's something I was wondering. You know, like you mentioned, Wetherspoons. To what extent people are sort of had their sort of heads turned by ideology and the propaganda, and you know, maybe not going with their interests, but and then that's translated into the splits. Both Labour and the Tories are fundamentally split for the same reasons or for different reasons.
I mean, for Labour, I believe it's frankly the joint prospect of the end of the social democratic consensus or possibility of its revival is kind of going, and then the neoliberal faction is also kind of at a bit of a loss because the basis for neoliberalism is also gone. So like they're not really having a good time in the Labour Party right now. Like I think they're pro-Remain is kind of within the Labour Party is kind of the general position of most of the neoliberal faction because of the affinity that they have to that kind of globalization period, the expectation it will continue in the same way. In the Conservative Party, it's a lot more pronounced, the disagreements, I believe. I think there are actually a lot more substance behind the disagreements in the Conservative Party. There's a lot more thought about what it means. The ERG obviously is they're the ones backing the disaster capitalists. I do think their time's kind of come to an end now, the European Research Group. I don't think we'll be seeing much of MOG again, for example. But
with any luck?
Yeah, with any luck. But I do think that the rest of the Conservative Party now, those splits have kind of been dealt with because he has a mandate at the end of the day. Johnson has a mandate now, so there's nothing they can do. I don't think.
Okay, so where are we up to? We're going to, the end of it's at the end of January now, isn't it? So
yeah.
What next?
He's presenting the bill today in Parliament, which will then lead to voting on it. I imagine Johnson will get a majority for the bill. And then we probably will have Brexit. I think the more pressing things for us to actually understand on the left are not to do with Brexit, because that's kind of like we're coming out of the end of the Brexit phase of British politics in terms of the actual politics of Brexit, in terms of how it happens, I believe. And we're coming into implementation. We're coming into the new politics of Britain after Brexit. And that's very dangerous. We're in very dangerous waters. So Johnson has, for example, in his manifesto, a promise to found a commission to rewrite Britain's constitution, for example. And that's a big deal, given this is a man who wanted to take Channel 4's broadcasting license away from them simply because they put an ice sculpture of him on a podium when he didn't turn up to a debate.
Yeah, they just, I think it was Friday or Saturday, that they issued a boycott of Radio 4. Yeah.
It's absurd.
For bias against them during the campaign.
And I don't remember how many big mistakes the BBC made with showing more favourable footage of Boris than they actually did. Quite a few.
He couldn't have asked for more, really. Well, no. Obviously he feels he could have done, but anyway.
Apparently Laura wasn't as friendly as she normally is. But the thing is right here is what's kind of the hysteria about Brexit is kind of now giving into a realization, I think, that the results of this process have left us with an incredibly far-right government as far as British standards go, with an incredible majority. And the discussions I've seen online a lot compare this to the 1980s. And this is nothing like the 1980s. Like, we need to really kind of get the 1980s have been and gone in our timeline here. Like, this is getting back to 1930s territory. This is getting to very dangerous, scary territory in terms of politics. We have a man who literally wants to rewrite the constitution. We have Priti Patel in his cabinet who wants to bring back the death penalty. We have, and I don't know if you saw that clip of Boris with when he was talking about the cornflakes in the box. No. And, right, so he was comparing them to human beings in human society, the cornflakes, and said that the intelligent ones are the ones on the top, and the ones at the bottom are the unintelligent ones. And Dominic Cummings believes this as well, and he believes that intelligence is a sign of spiritual worth. Literal spiritual worth, and that's a very eugenicsy, very fascist kind of belief system right there. And both him and Dominic Cummings are very invested in that. Dominic Cummings, who's Boris's advisor, for those who don't know, sorry. And Cummings' political idol is Otto von Bismarck. That's the kind of people in our country now. So, well, not our country, but yeah. So we're entering a period now where this is going to turn into could turn quite serious quite fast. And I don't think that anyone on the left is prepared for it, because our frame of reference in Britain, for example, most people's frame of reference for what looks like class struggle was the miners' strike, which we lost. So we're going to have to really, really take these people to task. And I think that constitution thing really is a key one. I think that now is the period where we should be a little bit more ambitious in terms of what we propose as communists. A little bit more, well, if Boris Johnson wants to write the constitution, what would a socialist constitution of this nation look like? These kind of things, and put forward that position and actually take it out and try and fight it.
Absolutely. Do you think they're prepared, or that they'll be forced to let go of colony in Ireland, and also possibly the breakup of the union with Scotland?
I think that the breakup of Scotland is going to be a secondary question here, in my opinion, initially. Although it probably will be the one that's in the press more. But the question of Ireland, it is huge, because if Britain doesn't sort of allow that kind of Republican tendency to win over this victory, really, then it's going to have to put boots on the ground in Ireland, really. And that's a big deal because the Republic of Ireland is part of the EU. And if Britain has troops near the Republic of Ireland or accidentally engages in a warlike manoeuvre with the Republic of Ireland in that context, to what extent will the EU view that as an attack upon an EU nation at this point? You know, you've got to consider things like that. So Ireland's going to be either it could be a civil war, it could be kind of a proxy war, it could be any number of things. I don't think Britain's going to let go of Ireland. It never has. I don't think it would just surrender. Frankly.
Yeah.
Scotland, I think they may be forced to have another referendum. I think that may be allowed, but I think if it is allowed, it's going to be so targeted by British information, disinformation, and all this kind of stuff that like no result is going to be allowed out that isn't what they want to happen.
Sure, but I mean, it was very close last time, and they had Project Fear last time. So if that would work a second time,
well, but I think the thing that has to be recognised as well is that last time the referendum was mostly about austerity because of the political context in which it occurred in. It was mostly about living conditions in Scotland, how Scottish people had less power over those than people in Britain, in kind of England and Wales, for example. You had that kind of process there. This time it's about Brexit. So it's kind of, it's hard to see whether or not it would inspire the same passion, I think, at this point. I think the SNP gives a good review of the electorate's kind of stance on it, and it might garner that kind of vote. But, I mean, we'll see. We'll see. Hard
Well, these are all hard ones, to be fair. Yeah. But I was trying to sort of end on a maybe slightly positive. But anyway, is there anything else you think we've missed, or?
I think if we want to end on a positive note, one thing I would add is that things are very scary now, and there's a lot going on, and it's very difficult for I think a lot of people to maintain optimism at the moment. But we can't give in to that because there's every reason to be optimistic, because for the longest period of my life, someone born in the 90s, nothing has happened. You know, it's just been the same shit constantly rolled out. And now I think we can all feel that there is a palpable sense that history is here and stuff's going to change and it needs to change. And I think that's not a sentiment that's just felt by the left anymore. I think that's felt by the whole of society at this point. And when that happens, people's ears open, and we could be in a very, very different position in a year or two even. And I think we just have to keep struggling forward. And I know it's not an easy period to deal with politics necessarily, and the arguments aren't easy. But if we win, then it's quite a definitive victory at this point, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, that was a bit nicer. I feel a bit better now. I'll be coming off the call and crying into my cornflakes. Just love the work you're doing, and
thank you very much, comrade.
Yeah, well, hopefully this podcast can take it onto the next level, because I was writing articles, and I thought, right, so about this time last year, I was like, right, I'm gonna take a topic, and I'm just gonna completely comprehensively cover it, and then I'll go on to the next topic. And I thought I'd be coming out with maybe take me a month to write all those, but at the end of that month I'd have like a dozen articles.
Yeah.
And I thought I'd be able to keep it up month after month. So I did the first month. I did the Royals.
Yeah.
And I wrote about a dozen articles. I thought, right, and it just burnt me out, and I've had to concentrate on work and other things since then. So I think podcasts are more manageable. Yeah,
I think the thing with content is because I mean, this year for Prolekult, I think I'm not going to be doing a 3-hour movie again. Let's just put it that way. Yeah. Fucking Christ. But
a friend of mine said, "Oh my God, the amount of work that's been put." He's like, "How many people worked on it?" And I was like, "I think it's just the two. It's just the two of you, isn't it?" And he's like, That's unbelievable. Yeah.
Yeah, we pulled like a solid month pretty much at the end of like working pretty much every hour God sent.
Yeah. So, yeah, and now I'm just left looking like I'm obsessed with the Royals. I've literally published nothing but the Royals all year. But
to be fair, though, I mean, like that's a fairly popular niche in British politics.
Yeah. I just last week I did an episode with a mate of mine on the Royals. So, and we just, but yeah. We're up to about 3 hours now on that.
Wow.
So I'm gonna have to cut that down. But yeah, it's there's some positive stuff if we focus on what we're doing. We do it. We can only do our best and put out good stuff, and world history will dictate the rest, won't it? So.
Well, yes, yeah, or it'll end. In which case, it won't matter much anyway. So.
Absolutely.
Zero-sum game, mate. It's fine.
Yeah. Jeez. Definitely enjoyed that, and hopefully I'll get better at it and not be as tired next time, and be able to speak a bit more cogently and stuff. But yeah, I think hopefully do it again.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do another episode. Absolutely,
awesome.
That was great.
Yeah. Right, I'll let you go then. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it as well.
No problem, comrade. Good to speak to you, and good to work on this.
You too. Cheers, mate.
Ta-ra.
Speak to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.